"You're too late," Samuel Reed's voice cracked across the rain-soaked platform, 10 years of waiting collapsing into those 3 words. But Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a yellowed envelope, his own handwriting staring back at him like a ghost. The letter he'd written before the war, the one she never answered. "Read it," she whispered, rain mixing with tears. "Then tell me I'm too late. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled." The evening train's whistle cut through Hollow Creek like a knife through old wounds, sharp and unforgiving. Samuel Reed stood on the platform where he'd stood 1,000 times before, but tonight felt different. Tonight the air tasted of endings and beginnings all at once, metallic and electric, with the promise of rain. His hands gripped the wooden railing, knuckles white against weathered oak, while the wind tugged at his hat brim with insistent fingers. 10 years. 10 years since he'd last waited on this platform for someone who mattered. 10 years since he'd believed in the kind of love that poets wrote about and fools died for. The station hadn't changed much, same peeling paint on the ticket booth, same crooked bench where old man Henderson used to sleep off his whiskey, same flickering lamp that cast dancing shadows across the empty tracks. But Samuel had changed. The war had seen to that. The years after had finished the job. The train appeared on the horizon like a memory taking shape, its headlight a single burning eye in the gathering dusk. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs, a sensation he'd almost forgotten, this feeling of anticipation mixed with dread. He'd told himself he wouldn't come, had spent the entire day convincing himself that the telegram was a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke. But here he was, drawn back to this place like a compass to true north, unable to resist the pull of a name he'd tried so hard to forget. Clara Mitchell. The name still hurt to think, like pressing on a bruise that never quite healed. He'd loved her with the kind of desperation only young men understood, the kind that made you believe you could reshape the world with your bare hands, if it meant keeping her smile aimed in your direction. She'd been everything: sunlight through honey, laughter that could chase away storms, hands that fit in his like they'd been carved from the same tree. The train began to slow, brakes squealing against wet rails. Samuel's breath caught in his chest. Around him, Hollow Creek Station remained eerily empty. The evening crowd had already dispersed, leaving only him and the ghosts of all the goodbyes this platform had witnessed. The few working lamps created pools of amber light that the darkness seemed to devour at the edges, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice before falling silent. The first car passed. Empty. The second showed only shadows of passengers eager to be elsewhere. Samuel felt foolish suddenly, standing there in his best jacket, the one he saved for funerals and failed attempts at moving on. Maybe she hadn't come after all. Maybe the telegram had been sent in error, or perhaps she'd changed her mind somewhere between wherever she'd been and here. God knew she'd done it before. Then the third car door opened and time stopped. She was thinner than he remembered, angles where there used to be curves, but it was unmistakably her. Clara stepped down onto the platform with careful precision, like someone who'd learned not to trust solid ground. Her hair, once the color of autumn wheat, showed threads of silver now, pulled back in a simple bun that made her cheekbones stand out stark and pronounced. She wore a gray coat that had seen better years, and her hands clutched a small leather satchel against her chest like a shield. But it was her eyes that undid him, those same green eyes that had haunted his dreams and poisoned his waking hours, now shadowed with something he couldn't quite name. Sorrow, perhaps, or regret. Maybe both, twisted together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Clara?" The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, barely more than a whisper, a question and an accusation all at once. She turned toward him slowly, as if she'd known exactly where he'd be standing, as if she'd pictured this moment as many times as he had. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other across 10 feet of platform that might as well have been the Grand Canyon. The train hissed steam between them, obscuring and revealing her face in turns, making the moment feel dreamlike and surreal. "Hello, Sam." Her voice was different too, quieter, worn smooth by whatever road she'd traveled. Not the bright, confident sound he remembered, but something more tentative, like she was testing each word before releasing it into the air. "You're too late." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, sharp with all the years of silence and unanswered questions. Whatever you came here for, you're too late. He watched her flinch, saw the way her grip tightened on the satchel, but she didn't look away. Instead, she took a step closer, then another, until she stood just beyond arm's reach. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, soft drops that made quiet promises against the platform's worn boards. "I know," Clara said simply, and there was such weight in those two words that Samuel felt them settle in his chest like stones. "I know I'm too late, Sam. I've known it for 10 years, but I had to come anyway. I had to—" She stopped, swallowing hard, and he saw her hand move to her coat pocket. "I have something you need to see." "I don't need anything from you." He forced the words out, tried to make them sound convincing, but they rang hollow even to his own ears. "You made your choice a long time ago, made it pretty damn clear what I meant to you." "That's not true." Her voice cracked slightly, and she pulled something from her pocket, an envelope, yellowed with age and bent at the corners. She held it out toward him, hand trembling slightly in the rain-dappled light. "You wrote this, didn't you?" Samuel's blood turned cold. He recognized it immediately, the cheap stationery he'd bought at Murphy's General Store, the way he'd creased the envelope, the deliberate care of his younger self's handwriting. He'd sent that letter 10 years ago, the day before he'd left for the war, when he'd still believed words could build bridges across any distance. "Where did you get that?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rough and raw. "It was delivered to my house," Clara said, stepping closer still. The rain was falling harder now, creating a curtain of sound around them. 6 months ago. Returned to sender, they said. Found in a postal warehouse in Richmond, in a bin of undelivered mail from 1915. A decade lost in some forgotten corner, gathering dust while we— She couldn't finish the sentence. Samuel stared at the envelope, refusing to take it, refusing to touch this ghost of his younger self's hope. "You never got it," he said slowly, the realization settling over him like ice water. "All this time, I thought you'd read it and chose not to answer. I thought—" "I sent a reply," Clara interrupted, and now her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The very next day after, I should have received your letter. I wrote back, Sam. I told you yes. I told you I'd wait for you, that I'd follow you anywhere, even if the whole world burned down around us. I told you I loved you." The platform seemed to tilt beneath Samuel's feet. "You're lying." "I'm not." She fumbled in her satchel with shaking hands and pulled out another envelope, this one even more worn than the first. "My father found it. Found your letter when it finally arrived, months late. He never gave it to me. And my letter to you—" Her voice broke. "He never mailed it. He thought you were beneath our family, thought the war would kill you anyway, and it wasn't worth the scandal of his daughter promising herself to a farmer's son." Samuel's world was rewriting itself with every word she spoke. 10 years of certainty crumbling, 10 years of carefully constructed bitterness revealing itself as a foundation built on lies. He reached out slowly, almost against his will, and took the second envelope from her trembling fingers. His name was written across the front in her handwriting, young, hopeful, looping letters that spoke of a girl who believed in happy endings. The seal had never been broken. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of all the years it had remained silent. "Open it," Clara whispered. "Please." The platform had emptied completely now. Even the train had pulled away, leaving them alone in the rain with only the distant rumble of thunder for company. Samuel's fingers trembled as he slipped one beneath the envelope's flap. The paper was brittle with age, tearing slightly as he worked it open. Inside, a single sheet, folded twice. He unfolded it carefully, afraid it might disintegrate in his hands. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "My dearest Sam, your letter reached me today, and I've read it 17 times already. Each time my heart says yes before my mind can even form the words. Yes, I'll wait for you. Yes, I'll marry you when you return. Yes, I'd follow you anywhere, even into the fire if that's where you're bound. You ask if I'm certain, if I understand what it means to tie my life to yours. Sam, I've never been more certain of anything. You are my North Star, my steady ground, my home. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Come back to me safe. Come back to me whole." And know that every day you're gone, I'll be counting the hours until I can see your face again. Yours, always and forever, Clara. The words blurred as rain and something else. Tears, he realized with distant surprise, made the ink run together. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the letter. This changed everything. Everything he'd believed about that time, about her choice, about the woman he'd thought had abandoned him for someone better. I waited, he managed to say, his voice barely audible over the rain. I waited at this station for 6 hours the day I came home. You never showed. Clara's face crumpled. I didn't know. By the time I learned you'd returned, you were already gone again. Moved west, they said. Started a new life. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. My father told me you'd married someone else, that you'd forgotten all about me. He showed me a newspaper announcement he'd forged. I believed him, Sam. God help me, I believed him. There was never anyone else. The confession cost him something to speak aloud. I tried. Lord knows I tried to move on, to find someone who could make me forget. But there was only ever you. The rain was soaking through their clothes now, turning the platform slick and dark. Clara took another step closer, close enough that he could have reached out and touched her, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, and the way her lips trembled as she tried to hold herself together. I married Robert Henderson 3 years after you left, she said quietly, and the name hit Samuel like a physical blow. Henderson, the banker's son, the one her father had always preferred. Not because I loved him, because I was tired of fighting, tired of my father's anger, tired of waiting for a man I thought had forgotten me. It was a mistake from the first day, but I made my bed, as they say. Are you still... Samuel couldn't finish the question. He died 2 years ago, influenza. There was no emotion in her voice when she said it, just a flat statement of fact. I nursed him to the end because it was the right thing to do, but I won't lie to you and say I grieved. You can't mourn what you never truly had. Thunder rolled overhead, closer now. Samuel looked at the letter in his hands, then at the woman before him, a stranger wearing Clara's face, carrying Clara's voice, holding pieces of a past that should have been theirs together. The unfairness of it all threatened to choke him. Why now? He asked. Why come here now after all this time? What do you want from me, Clara? She met his eyes steadily, rain streaming down her face. I want you to know the truth. I want you to know that I loved you, that I never stopped, even when I thought you'd moved on. I want you to know that not a day went by when I didn't think about what we could have had. She paused, drawing a shaky breath. And I want to say goodbye properly, the way we should have 10 years ago. Goodbye. The word tasted like ashes in his mouth. I've spent a decade living a half-life, Sam. Married to a man I didn't love, playing the role my father wanted, dying by inches in a house that never felt like home. When that letter was finally delivered, when I read your words after all these years, she pressed her hand to her chest, over her heart. It was like waking up from a long sleep, like remembering I was alive. So you came here to absolve yourself? Bitterness crept into his voice despite his best efforts. To unburden your conscience before moving on to whatever's next. No. Clara shook her head firmly. I came here because you deserve to know the truth. Because the man who wrote that letter deserved better than silence. Because maybe, somewhere under all these years and all this pain, there's a chance for... She stopped herself, looking away. I don't know what I'm hoping for. I just knew I had to come. Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, some wall he'd built brick by brick over the years. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw beneath the gray hair and the worn coat to the girl he'd loved so fiercely it had nearly destroyed him. She was still there, buried under layers of time and sorrow, but still there. I built a life here, he said slowly, carefully. After the war, after you, I came back to Hollow Creek and I built something. It's not much, a small farm, a house that's more holes than walls some days, but it's mine. It's honest work with honest people, and it's been enough to keep me going. I'm glad, Clara said, and he could hear that she meant it. I'm glad you found something, Sam. That's more than I managed. The rain showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was falling harder, turning the world into a watercolor painting where edges blurred and ran together. Samuel realized he was still holding her letter, the paper growing soft with moisture. He folded it carefully, then slipped it into his own pocket, right next to his heart. "You said you wanted to say goodbye properly," he said. "How does that look exactly?" "Because I said goodbye to you 100 times in my head, and it never felt right, never felt like enough." Clara's smile was sad and small. "I don't know. I thought maybe if we could talk, really talk about what happened and what could have been, maybe then we could both let it go. Let each other go. Let go." Samuel tested the phrase, rolled it around in his mind. "I've been trying to let go for 10 years. Hasn't worked yet." "I know," she whispered. "Me neither." They stood there in the rain, two people shaped by absence and misunderstanding, by letters that never reached their destinations and words that arrived too late. The station was completely dark now except for that one flickering lamp, painting them in unreliable light that made it hard to tell what was real and what was shadow. "There's a diner," Samuel heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere beyond rational thought. "About 2 blocks east. They serve coffee that tastes like motor oil and pie that could probably save your soul if you let it. We could, if you wanted, we could go there. Talk somewhere dry." Hope flickered across Clara's face, tentative and fragile. "I'd like that." "It doesn't mean anything," he added quickly, needing to establish boundaries even as he felt them crumbling. "Just coffee, just talking." "Just coffee," she agreed, but something in her eyes suggested they both knew it meant more than that. Samuel gestured toward the station steps, and they began walking side by side, careful not to touch, maintaining a respectful distance that felt both necessary and impossible. Their footsteps echoed on the wet boards, a rhythm that seemed to count out the years between them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "I used to imagine this," Clara said as they descended to street level. "Running into you somewhere. What I'd say, how you'd react. In my mind, you were always angry. Rightfully so." "I was angry," Samuel admitted. "For years I was furious. At you, at God, at the whole damn world. I carried it around like a second skin." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But anger's a hard thing to maintain when you don't know what you're angry at. Eventually, it just turned into sadness, then numbness, then nothing at all." "Nothing sounds lonely." "It is." They walked in silence for a while, the rain creating a white noise that made the world feel smaller, more intimate. The streets of Hollow Creek were mostly empty, windows glowing warm against the storm. Samuel had walked these streets countless times, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every storefront, every shortcut. But tonight, with Clara beside him, it all felt foreign, like seeing a familiar painting hung in a different room. The diner appeared ahead, its neon sign, Betty's Place, buzzing and flickering in the downpour. Through the rain-streaked windows, Samuel could see a handful of patrons nursing coffee and conversation. The bell above the door chimed as he held it open for Clara, and the warm, coffee-scented air that rushed out felt like a different world entirely. Betty herself looked up from behind the counter, her eyebrows rising slightly when she saw Samuel with a woman. In the 5 years he'd been coming here, he'd always been alone. She was too polite to comment, though, simply nodding them toward a booth by the window. They slid into opposite sides, the red vinyl squeaking slightly under their wet clothes. A moment later, Betty appeared with 2 cups of coffee and a knowing look. "Pie?" she asked, her voice carrying the warm rasp of someone who'd smoked for 40 years and enjoyed every minute. "2 slices of whatever you've got," Samuel said, and Betty nodded, disappearing back toward the kitchen. Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, and Samuel noticed they were shaking slightly. From cold or emotion, he couldn't tell. Maybe both. She looked around the diner with careful attention, taking in the worn booths and faded photographs on the walls, the jukebox in the corner that only played songs from before the war. "Is this your place?" she asked. "The place you come to think? How did you—" Samuel stopped, realizing the answer. "I guess some things don't change. You always could read me." "You always wore your heart on your sleeve," Clara said softly. "It's one of the things I loved about you." You felt everything so deeply, so honestly. It scared me sometimes, how much you felt. And you were always good at hiding what you felt. Made you mysterious. Made me want to solve the puzzle of you. He took a sip of his coffee. She was right. It did taste terrible. And studied her face. Guess I never managed it. There was no puzzle, Sam. I was just a girl who loved you and was too afraid of disappointing her father to fight for it. That's not mysterious. That's just cowardice. Betty returned with 2 massive slices of apple pie, still warm from the oven. She set them down with a quiet efficiency and retreated without a word, sensing perhaps that this conversation needed space. Clara picked up her fork but didn't eat, just traced patterns in the crust. When I got your letter 6 months ago, after all that time, I sat in my kitchen and read it over and over. Then I pulled out my reply, the one my father never sent, and I read them together, your words and mine, like a conversation finally happening. And I wept, Sam. I wept for days. Clara, no, let me finish, please. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. I wept because I saw what we could have had, what we should have had. All the years we lost because of one man's pride and a postal system that failed us. I wept because I realized I'd spent 10 years in a marriage that was really a kind of prison, and you'd spent 10 years thinking I'd betrayed you. And then I wept because I knew it was too late to fix any of it. Then why come? The question burst out of him, raw and desperate. If you knew it was too late, why put us both through this? Clara set down her fork, abandoned the pretense of eating. Because I needed you to know the truth. Because carrying that letter around, knowing you thought I'd rejected you, it was eating me alive. And because, she drew a shaky breath, because I'm selfish enough to want one honest conversation with you before we both move on with our lives. One moment where we can acknowledge what we meant to each other without all the lies and misunderstandings between us. Outside, lightning flickered, turning the rain-soaked street silver for a heartbeat. Samuel felt the weight of her words, the truth in them, the impossible situation they found themselves in. 2 people who'd loved each other fiercely, separated by circumstances beyond their control, now sitting across from each other with a decade of damage between them. I don't know if I can give you that, he said honestly. I don't know if I can separate what I felt then from what I feel now. It's all twisted up together, Clara. The love and the hurt, the hope and the bitterness. I can't just untangle it over coffee and pie. I'm not asking you to untangle anything. I'm just asking you to sit with me for a while, to let me tell you what happened after you left, and to tell me what happened to you. To fill in the gaps so we both know the whole story. She reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of his. Can you give me that much? Samuel looked at her hand so close to his own and felt the pull of every memory, every dream he'd tried to bury. He thought about the letter in his pocket, her words from 10 years ago, still true if the dates were wrong. He thought about the man he'd been, and the man he'd become, and the girl who'd shaped both versions. All right, he said finally, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff. Tell me your story. I'll tell you mine. And then, he didn't know how to finish that sentence. And then we'll see, Clara finished for him, and there was something in her voice, hope, maybe, or fear, or both wounds so tight you couldn't tell them apart. So she began to talk, and Samuel listened, and the rain continued to fall on Hollow Creek, washing away the dust of years and leaving everything clean and uncertain and impossibly new. Clara's voice was steady when she began, but Samuel could hear the tremor underneath, like a fault line waiting to shift. She told him about the months after he'd left for the war, how she'd waited by the window every afternoon for the postman, how her heart had leaped and fallen with each delivery that wasn't from him. She described the growing anxiety, the way her father had watched her with those calculating eyes, sensing her distraction and disapproving of its source. He knew, she said, fingers wrapped tight around her coffee cup. Even before your letter arrived, he knew where my heart was. And he hated it, hated that I'd given myself to someone he considered beneath our station. Her laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass, as if station mattered when the whole world was tearing itself apart. Samuel said nothing, just listened, watching the play of emotions across her face. The diner hummed around them, the clink of dishes, low murmured conversations, the hiss of the grill, but it all faded into background static. There was only her voice, filling in the gaps of years he'd spent constructing his own version of events. When your letter finally came, 6 months late, forwarded from one postal depot to another, Clara paused, closing her eyes as if the memory still had the power to wound. I was in the garden. I saw the postman coming up the walk, saw him hand the envelope to our housekeeper. I knew somehow that it was from you. I just knew. But my father intercepted it before it reached my hands. He read it first, Samuel said, the realization settling cold in his stomach. He read it first, Clara confirmed, opening her eyes to meet his. And then he made a decision that shaped the rest of our lives. He kept it from me, Sam, locked it in his desk drawer and told me nothing. Meanwhile, I was going mad with worry. No word from you in months. Newspapers full of casualty lists. I imagined you dead in some muddy trench, your last thoughts of me, wondering why I'd never written back. The coffee had gone cold in Samuel's cup, but he took a sip anyway, needing something to do with his hands. When did you find out? About the letter? 3 years later. Claire's voice dropped to almost a whisper. 3 years after you'd come home and left again. 3 years after I'd married Robert Henderson in a church full of people who all knew I was making a terrible mistake. I found it by accident, looking through my father's papers when he took ill. There it was, your letter, with all your hope and love preserved in ink, hidden away like contraband. She pulled the envelope from her pocket again, laid it on the table between them. In the diner's fluorescent light, it looked even more fragile, more improbable, a message from the past that had missed its moment by years. I confronted him, Claire continued, her voice hardening with old anger. Demanded to know how he could do such a thing. And do you know what he said? She didn't wait for Samuel to answer. He said he'd done me a favor. Said you would have gotten yourself killed in the war anyway, and even if you hadn't, you'd have dragged me down to a life of poverty and struggle. He said I should be grateful he'd steered me toward Robert, toward security and respectability. And what did you say to that? Claire's smile was sad and distant. I told him he'd killed the only part of me that mattered, that he could keep his security and respectability because I'd never feel anything again except the weight of what he'd stolen from us. Then I left his room and I never spoke to him about it again. He died 6 months later and I didn't shed a single tear. Thunder rumbled outside, a long, low growl that seemed to shake the windows. Samuel processed her words, tried to fit them into the narrative he'd carried for so long. His anger at her had been a living thing, fed by the belief that she'd chosen comfort over him, chosen her father's approval over their love. But she'd been as much a victim as he had, trapped by circumstance and deception. Your letter, he said carefully, nodding toward the second envelope still in his pocket. The one you wrote back. Tell me about that. Clara drew a shaky breath. I wrote it the day after your letter should have arrived. I'd been checking the mail obsessively, and when nothing came by late afternoon, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I knew you were leaving soon for the front. I knew time was running out. So I sat down and I wrote everything I felt, everything I'd been too afraid to say out loud. I told you yes to all of it, the future, the marriage, the life together. I sealed it and gave it to my father to post, because the mail office closed early on Wednesdays and I had a fitting for a dress I didn't care about. He never mailed it. He never mailed it, Clara echoed. He told me he had. For 2 weeks I walked around in a state of grace, believing my words were on their way to you, believing that soon we'd be planning our future. Then the reports started coming back from the front, the casualties. And still no word from you. I thought, her voice cracked. I thought you'd received my letter and decided I wasn't worth coming back for. Or worse, that you'd died before you could reply. Samuel felt something shift inside him, some fundamental understanding of pain reorganizing itself. He'd spent years nursing his own hurt, building walls around it, letting it define him. But Clara had carried her own version of that pain, equally deep, equally scarring. They'd both been wounded by the same blade, just from different angles. I came back, he said quietly, after the armistice. I came straight back to Hollow Creek, and the first thing I did was go to your house. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You came to the house? Your father answered the door. The memory was still vivid, still sharp. I asked for you. I was still in my uniform, still dirty from the journey. I must have looked half wild. He stood there in the doorway blocking my view inside, and he told me you'd moved on, said you were engaged to Robert Henderson, that the wedding was planned for the following month. He said—" Samuel had to stop, the words sticking in his throat. "What did he say?" Clara's voice was barely audible. "He said you'd asked him to tell me not to contact you again, that you were embarrassed by your wartime fancy, and you'd appreciate it if I respected your wishes and stayed away." Samuel watched Clara's face crumble, watched her hand fly to her mouth. "I believed him. Why wouldn't I? You'd never written, never sent word. It all made sense in a horrible kind of way." "Oh God, Sam, oh God!" Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, unchecked and unashamed. "I was there. I was upstairs in my room that day. I heard the doorbell, heard voices, but my father told me later it was just a salesman. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea you were there. But you didn't know. Just like I didn't know about the letters. Just like we both didn't know we were being played like puppets by a man who thought he knew better." Samuel felt a strange calm settling over him, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and you're surveying the damage. "We were children, Clara. We thought love was enough. We didn't account for the cruelty of people who thought they were protecting us." Clara wiped at her eyes with her napkin, her composure fragmenting. "I stood at that altar with Robert, and all I could think about was you. Every vow I spoke felt like a betrayal. Every promise felt like ash in my mouth. And for 10 years I lived in that betrayal, day after day, pretending to be a wife to a man I could barely stand to look at." "Did he know? Henderson? Did he know you didn't love him?" "He knew." Clara's voice was flat now, drained of emotion. "He knew from the beginning. I think that's why he drank so much toward the end. He'd won me the way you'd win a prize at a carnival, but he couldn't make me happy, couldn't make me forget you. It poisoned him, that knowledge. Poisoned us both." Betty appeared then, moving with quiet efficiency to refill their coffee cups. She glanced at Clara's tears, at Samuel's rigid posture, and set down the pot with extra care, as if loud noises might shatter whatever fragile thing was happening in this booth. She retreated without a word, and Samuel found himself grateful for her discretion. "I need to know something," Samuel said after a moment, his voice rougher than he intended. "When you found my letter 3 years late, already married, why didn't you leave him? Why didn't you come find me then?" Clara met his eyes, and in them he saw layers of regret so deep they seemed bottomless. "Because I thought you'd moved on. My father, before I found the letter, he'd shown me a newspaper clipping, an engagement announcement with your name on it. Some girl from Wyoming," he said. "He showed me the paper, Sam. It looked real. It was fake." The words came out flat, certain. There was never anyone else, never even came close." "I know that now. After he died, I went through all his papers, found a receipt from a printer in Richmond. He'd had it forged, had it made to look like a real newspaper page. He'd thought of everything." Clara's laugh was hollow, broken. "By the time I discovered the truth, 5 more years had passed. I tried to find you then, sent letters to every Samuel Reed I could locate out west. But you'd moved around so much, and I was using your name from before the war, not knowing if you'd changed it, or she—" "I came back to Hollow Creek," Samuel interrupted. 4 years ago. Bought old Henderson's farm, no relation to your Robert, and I've been here ever since, right under your nose in a manner of speaking." Clara's face showed her shock. "You've been here? In town? For 4 years?" "I needed to come home, or what passes for home. The wandering wasn't fixing anything, just putting miles between me and memories that followed anyway." He paused, considering his next words. "I heard about your husband's passing, saw the notice in the paper. I thought about going to the funeral, paying respects, but I figured—" "You figured I wouldn't want to see you. I figured it would hurt too much, for both of us." Samuel ran his hand through his damp hair, a gesture of frustration and weariness. "Seems like we've spent 10 years making assumptions about what the other wanted, what the other felt, and every single one of them was wrong." The rain had softened to a steady patter against the windows, no longer the violent downpour, but something gentler, more resigned. The diner was emptying out as the evening grew late, other patrons paying their bills and heading home to dry clothes and warm beds. But Samuel and Clara remained, anchored in their booth, wading through the wreckage of their past. Tell me about the war, Clara said suddenly. You've heard my story. Tell me yours. Tell me what happened to the boy who wrote that letter. Samuel inhaled deeply, tasting the diner's air, coffee and grease and thyme. No one had ever asked him about the war, not really. People in town knew he'd served, saw the distant look that sometimes crossed his face, and they'd learned not to press. But Clara was asking, and somehow that made all the difference. The boy who wrote that letter died in France, he said simply. Not literally, obviously I'm sitting here, but the person I was, the one who believed in clean endings and noble causes, he didn't make it back. What happened? What always happens in war. I saw things no one should see. Did things I'll never be able to justify, no matter how many times I'm told they were necessary. I watched boys I'd grown up with die in mud, calling for their mothers. I learned that bravery and cowardice look identical when you're scared enough. I discovered that the human body is both impossibly resilient and pathetically fragile, sometimes in the same moment. Samuel's hands had started to shake, and he pressed them flat against the table to still them. Clara reached across without hesitation this time, covering his hand with hers. The touch sent electricity through him, a current he'd thought long dead. I carried your memory with me, he continued, his voice dropping lower. Through all of it. When things got bad, and they got bad more often than not, I'd close my eyes and think about you. About the way you laughed at my terrible jokes, about how your hair smelled like lilacs in the spring, about the future I thought we'd have. It kept me alive, Clara. The idea of you kept me alive. Sam, and when I came home and found out you'd moved on, it broke something in me that the war hadn't managed to break. I realized I'd survived hell thinking there was something worth surviving for, only to discover it was all a fantasy. That the girl I'd loved was marrying someone else. That the future I'd clung to was never going to happen. Clara's grip on his hand tightened. I'm so sorry. I'm so desperately sorry for all of it. For my father's cruelty, for the letters that never arrived, for the years we lost. If I could go back, but you can't. Samuel said it gently, without accusation. Neither of us can. What's done is done, Clara. We can't rewrite the past no matter how much we might want to. Then what do we do with this? She gestured between them, at the letters on the table, at the shared pain that hung in the air like smoke. What do we do with the truth, now that we finally have it? Samuel didn't have an answer. He looked at her. This woman who was and wasn't the girl he'd loved, who'd been shaped by the same losses he had, who'd carried her own scars through the years. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and impossibility in equal measure. I don't know it, he admitted finally. I don't know if knowing the truth makes it better or worse. I don't know if it changes anything or if it's just adding more weight to what we're already carrying. It matters to me, Clara said fiercely. Knowing you didn't forget me, that you didn't choose to leave, it matters. Knowing I didn't betray you, that I fought in the only ways I knew how, that matters too. Does it? Or does it just make it more tragic? Two people who loved each other, kept apart by circumstances and lies, both suffering for years over a misunderstanding. Samuel felt the bitterness creeping back into his voice and tried to push it down. Maybe it would have been easier if one of us actually had moved on. At least then there'd be a reason for all this pain. Don't say that. Clara's eyes flashed with something like anger. Don't diminish what we felt. What we still feel, if we're being honest. Yes, it's tragic. Yes, it's unfair. But it was real, Sam. It is real, and that means something, even if we don't know what to do with it. The truth of her words hit him like a physical force. She was right. He did still feel it. Despite the years, despite the hurt, despite every rational reason to let it go, the love was still there, buried under layers of scar tissue, but alive nonetheless. He could feel it now, sitting across from her, painful and insistent as a healing wound. I spent 10 years trying to stop loving you, he said, the confession coming out rough and unpolished. Tried everything short of cutting out my own heart, but it didn't work. You were always there, Clara, in every sunrise, every song, every moment when I let my guard down. I'd see something beautiful, and my first thought was always, I wish Clara could see this. And then I'd remember you were gone, and it would hurt all over again. Clara's tears had started fresh, silent streams down her cheeks. I know, God, Sam, I know. There were nights I'd lie next to Robert, and I'd close my eyes and pretend he was you. How awful is that? How cruel to both of us. But I couldn't help it. My mind would wander back to the last time I saw you before the war, and I'd try to rewrite the ending. Try to imagine a world where the letters arrived, where my father didn't interfere, where we got our happy ending. And did it help, the imagining? No, she whispered. It just made the reality harder to bear. They sat there in the fluorescent glow of Betty's place, two broken people holding the pieces of what might have been. Outside, Hollow Creek slept on, oblivious to the quiet devastation happening in a corner booth. The jukebox in the corner started playing unbidden, some old blues number about lost love and roads not taken, and Samuel wondered if Betty had started it, if this was her way of providing a soundtrack to their sorrow. I saw you once, Clara said suddenly. About 2 years ago, you were in Murphy's General Store buying seed or supplies or something. I was across the street. I recognized you immediately, even after all those years, even though you'd changed. My heart stopped, Sam. Just stopped. And I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if I should cross the street, if I should say something. But then I thought about my father's lies, about the engagement announcement he'd shown me, and I convinced myself you'd moved on, that you had a wife somewhere, maybe children, that seeing me would just be an unwelcome reminder of the past. I was alone then, Samuel said quietly. I'm still alone now. There's been no one, Clara. No wife, no children, no one to share that broken-down farmhouse with except a dog who's better company than most people anyway. I wasted it, Clara said, her voice breaking. I wasted the chance. I was standing right there, 50 feet from you, and I wasted it because I was afraid. Because I'd spent so long believing you didn't want me that I couldn't imagine a world where you still did. We've both wasted chances. We're experts at it by now. Samuel tried for a smile, but it felt wrong on his face. The question is, what do we do now? We've laid everything out on this table. We know the truth. We know we were both victims of circumstance and manipulation. So what comes next? Clara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize it, or perhaps trying to reconcile the man before her with the boy in her memory. I don't know what comes next. I came here to say goodbye, to give you closure, to free us both from the weight of not knowing. But now that I'm here, now that I've seen you and talked to you, she paused, struggling for words. I don't know if I can say goodbye. Not again. Not when I just got you back. You don't have me back, Samuel said, but there was no conviction in his words. We've just shared our stories. That's all this is. Is it? Clara challenged. Is that really all this is, Sam? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like a lot more than that. It feels like the universe giving us one more chance, however impossible, however late. And maybe we're fools to even consider it, but we are fools to consider it, Samuel interrupted. What are we supposed to do, Clara? Pick up where we left off? Pretend the last 10 years didn't happen? We're different people now. We've lived entire lives apart. You can't just walk back into my world and expect everything to fall into place like it's some kind of fairy tale. I'm not expecting a fairy tale, Clara shot back, her own frustration finally showing. I don't know what I'm expecting. Maybe just a chance. Maybe just the possibility of something real, something honest, after years of living a lie. Is that so impossible? Yes, Samuel said, but even as he said it, he felt the word ringing false. Yes, it's impossible. We've hurt each other too much. The timing is wrong. It's always been wrong. The timing was wrong because it was stolen from us, Claire insisted. Not because we chose it. Not because we didn't love each other enough. We were cheated, Sam, out of everything we should have had. And now we have a choice. We can let that theft define the rest of our lives, or we can try to take something back. Samuel stood abruptly, the movement sending his coffee cup rattling against its saucer. He needed space, needed air, needed to think without Clara's eyes on him, without the weight of her hope pressing against his carefully constructed defenses. He walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watched the rain trace patterns down the pane. I built a life without you, he said to his reflection. It's not much of a life, maybe. It's lonely and it's small, and most days it feels like I'm just going through the motions. But it's mine. It's manageable. I know its dimensions. I know its limits. What you're suggesting, it would tear all that apart. It would mean opening myself up to the possibility of losing you all over again. And Clara, I barely survived it the first time. I don't think I could do it twice. He heard her stand, felt her approach, though she didn't touch him. She stood just behind him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, distant enough to give him space. I'm not asking you to risk everything tonight, she said softly. I'm not asking for promises or commitments or some grand gesture. I'm just asking if we can try. If we can take this one impossible conversation and turn it into another one tomorrow, and then maybe another one the day after that. Small steps, Sam. Just small steps towards something that might resemble forgiveness, might resemble healing. And if it doesn't work? He turned to face her, and God, she was so close. Close enough to touch, close enough to kiss, close enough to hurt him all over again. What happens when we realize we're just two broken people who can't fix each other? What happens when the past is too heavy to carry forward? Then at least we'll know, Clara said, and there was a strength in her voice he hadn't heard before. At least we'll have tried. At least we won't spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been if we'd been brave enough to reach for it. Samuel searched her face, looking for doubt, for uncertainty, for anything that would give him permission to walk away. But all he saw was determination mixed with fear, hope battling with realism, the same war he was fighting in his own heart. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to let you in again. I've spent so long keeping everyone at arm's length. It's become who I am. Then we'll figure it out together, Clara said. The same way we would have 10 years ago if we'd been given the chance. We'll stumble and we'll make mistakes and we'll probably hurt each other a dozen more times before we get it right. But at least we'll be doing it honestly. At least we'll be doing it with all the cards on the table. The rain was letting up now, the storm moving east toward the mountains. In the silence of the diner, Betty had disappeared into the back, giving them privacy. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, thunderous and insistent. He thought about the letters in his pocket, about the words they'd written to each other across impossible distances. He thought about the boy he'd been and the man he'd become, about the girl Clara had been and the woman she was now. One day at a time, he heard himself say, the words emerging from someplace deeper than reason. That's all I can promise. One day at a time, and we see where it goes. Clara's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, tentative but real. One day at a time, she echoed. That's all I'm asking. They stood there by the window, not touching but connected by something stronger than physical contact, by truth finally spoken, by wounds finally acknowledged, by the slim, terrifying possibility of a second chance. Outside, Hollow Creek began to stir from its rain-soaked slumber, lights flickering on in windows, the world preparing to continue despite everything that had changed in this small corner of it. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out Clara's letter, the one she'd written 10 years ago. He unfolded it carefully, read her words one more time in the diner's harsh light. Then he did something he hadn't planned, something that surprised even himself. He took her hand and pressed the letter into her palm. Keep it, he said. It belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. A reminder that we were real once, that we could be real again. Clara's fingers closed around the paper and then around his hand, and for the first time in 10 years, Samuel Reed allowed himself to hold on instead of letting go. They walked out of Betty's place into a world washed clean by rain, the streets of Hollow Creek gleaming under street lamps like polished stone. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility, and Samuel found himself acutely aware of Clara beside him, the small space between them charged with everything they'd said and everything they'd left unspoken. He didn't know where they were going, only that neither of them seemed ready to part ways, to let this fragile reconnection dissolve into the night. "Where are you staying?" he asked, his voice sounding strange in the quiet street, too casual for the weight of the moment. "I haven't figured that out yet," Clara admitted. "I came straight from the station to find you. I didn't think beyond that." Samuel stopped walking, turned to face her fully. "There's a boarding house on Maple Street. Mrs. Carson runs it. She's discreet, doesn't ask questions. I could walk you there, help you get settled." "Or," Clara said, and there was something tentative but determined in her voice, "you could show me this farm of yours, This life you built. I'd like to see it, if you're willing." Every rational part of Samuel's brain screamed caution. Bringing her to his home, his private sanctuary, felt like opening a door he might not be able to close again. But he found himself nodding anyway, found his feet already turning toward the edge of town where his truck was parked. "It's not much," he warned as they walked. "And it's a mess. I wasn't expecting company." "I don't care about mess," Clara said softly. "I just want to see where you've been all this time. Want to understand the shape of the life I wasn't part of." The truck was old, a battered Ford that had seen better decades, and it coughed to life with a sound like a dying animal. Clara climbed in without hesitation, settling into the worn passenger seat as if she belonged there. Samuel pulled out onto Main Street, the headlights cutting through the remnants of fog that clung to the ground. They drove in silence for a while, leaving the town behind, heading into the dark countryside where the only lights were scattered farmhouses and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting from the roadside, deer or raccoons or other creatures of the night. Samuel kept stealing glances at Clara, still half convinced she might disappear, that this whole evening had been some kind of fever dream brought on by loneliness and wishful thinking. "I used to imagine this," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Driving with you somewhere, anywhere, just the two of us, and the open road. I had this fantasy that you'd come back from the war and we'd just drive until we ran out of road, start over somewhere nobody knew us." "We could have," Samuel said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "If things had been different, if the letters had arrived, we could have done exactly that." "Do you ever think about it, the alternate version of our lives?" "Every day," Samuel admitted. "Every single day for 10 years. I think about who we would have been, what we would have built together. I think about children we never had, Christmases we never celebrated, ordinary mornings we never woke up to. It's like living with a ghost, Clara, the ghost of everything that should have been." Clara was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the window glass. "I named them once, the children we never had. Is that crazy? I was lying in bed one night next to Robert, and I couldn't sleep, and I just started thinking about what I would have named our babies, if we'd had them, if we'd had that life." Something cracked in Samuel's chest. "What did you name them?" "James, after your father, and Sarah after mine, before she died, when she was still good and kind." Clara's voice was thick with unshed tears. "I had whole lives planned out for them. What they'd look like, what they'd be like. James would have had your stubbornness and my sense of humor. Sarah would have been quiet and thoughtful, always reading. They'd have grown up on a farm somewhere, with dirt under their fingernails and sunshine in their hair." "Stop," Samuel said, his voice breaking. "Please stop. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "No, it's not that." He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, killed the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear both of their breathing, ragged and uneven. "It's just, I did the same thing, had the same thoughts, and hearing you say it out loud makes it real in a way it never was before, makes the loss real." They sat there in the darkness of the cab, and without planning it, without thinking about consequences or complications, Samuel reached for her. Clara came to him without hesitation, crossing the space between the seats, and suddenly she was in his arms for the first time in 10 years. She fit there differently than he remembered. They were both changed, both carrying new angles and old wounds, but somehow it still felt right. Still felt like coming home. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered against his shoulder. "I'm sorry for all of it. For the children we didn't have, for the life we didn't live, for every moment that was stolen from us." "It wasn't your fault," Samuel said, and he realized he truly believed it now. The anger he'd carried for so long had finally burned itself out, leaving only this aching sadness and the smallest spark of something that might be hope. "It was never your fault." They held each other there in the cab of his old truck on the side of a country road, while the night pressed in around them. It wasn't romantic, wasn't the stuff of stories or songs. It was just two damaged people trying to find comfort in the only place it had ever existed for them, in each other's arms. And for now, in this moment, it was enough. When they finally pulled apart, both sets of eyes were wet. Samuel started the truck again without a word, and they continued down the road. 5 minutes later, he turned onto a rutted driveway marked by a leaning mailbox with his name painted in fading letters. The farmhouse appeared in the headlights like a confession. It was small, weathered, listing slightly to one side as if tired of standing upright. The porch sagged, the paint had given up years ago, and one of the shutters hung at a drunken angle. But the light Samuel had left on glowed warm in the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. He'd banked the fire before leaving, and it had kept burning. "Home sweet home," he said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Told you it wasn't much." Clara was already opening her door, climbing down from the truck. She stood in the yard, looking at the house with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. He joined her, suddenly seeing his property through her eyes, the barn that needed new boards, the fence that needed mending, the garden plot he'd let go wild. "It's perfect," Clara said, and she sounded like she meant it. "You're being kind. It's a wreck." "It's yours," she corrected, turning to look at him. "It's honest and real, and you built it with your own hands. That makes it perfect." A dog barked from inside the house, deep and insistent. Samuel had forgotten about Blue, his shepherd mix, who was probably wondering why his human had been gone so long. He led Clara up the porch steps, careful to point out the loose board, and opened the front door. Blue came bounding out immediately, all wagging tail and eager tongue, jumping up on Samuel before noticing Clara. The dog stopped short, tilted his head, then approached her carefully, sniffing at her extended hand. "He's beautiful," Clara said, scratching behind Blue's ears. The dog leaned into her touch, already won over. "What's his name?" "Blue. Found him half-starved by the side of the road 2 years back. Vet said he'd been abandoned, probably considered worthless for farm work because of his bad leg." Samuel gestured to the dog's slight limp. "But he's been good company, better than most people." "I can see why you kept him," Clara said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she was talking about more than just the dog. Samuel led her inside, suddenly hyper-aware of the bachelor disarray of his home. Dishes in the sink, newspapers on the table, his spare boots by the door. But Clara didn't seem to notice or care. She moved through the small living room with careful attention, taking in the worn furniture, the books stacked on every available surface, the photographs on the mantel. She stopped at the photographs, picking up one that showed Samuel with 3 other men, all of them younger, all in uniform. "The war?" she asked quietly. "France, 1918, 6 months before the armistice." Samuel came to stand beside her. "That's Tommy Miller on the left. He didn't make it home. Caught shrapnel at Bellow Wood. The one in the middle is Jack Chen. He made it back but lost his arm. Haven't seen him in years. And that's David Morrison on the right. He's got a farm about 20 miles north of here. We have dinner sometimes, when the memories get too loud." Clara set the photograph down carefully, reverently. "Thank you for telling me, for not shutting me out." "I've shut everyone out for 10 years, Samuel said. "I'm tired of it. Tired of carrying everything alone." She moved to the next photograph, and Samuel watched her face change as she recognized it. It was old, faded, taken at the county fair the summer before the war. Clara at 17, laughing at something off camera, the sun in her hair, joy written in every line of her face. And beside her, a young Samuel, looking at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. "You kept this," Clara whispered, her fingers trembling as they touched the frame. "I kept everything," Samuel admitted. "Every photograph, every memory, every scrap of proof that you were real, that what we had was real. I told myself I'd burn it all 100 times, but I never could. It was all I had left of you." Clara turned to him, tears streaming freely now. "I kept everything too. Every letter you sent before the war, every small thing you ever gave me. I hid them in a box in the back of my closet where Robert would never find them. And on the hardest days, the ones where I thought I might disappear entirely, I'd take them out and remember who I used to be." The space between them felt charged, dangerous. Samuel knew he should step back, should maintain some distance, should protect himself from the inevitable hurt that came with letting Clara back into his heart. But he was so tired of protecting himself, so tired of being alone. "I don't know how to do this," he said for the second time that night. "I don't know how to be close to someone again. How to trust that it won't all fall apart." "Neither do I," Clara said. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out together, one moment at a time." She reached for him then, her hand cupping his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Samuel closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, memorizing the feel of it. When he opened them again, Clara was watching him with such tenderness it nearly broke him. "Can I stay?" she asked softly. "Just for tonight. I don't want to be alone. And I don't think you do either." Every warning bell in Samuel's head was ringing, but he nodded anyway. "I'll make up the spare room." "No," Clara said. "I mean, I'm not asking for anything except this. Just to be near you. To wake up and know this wasn't a dream. We can figure out everything else tomorrow." So Samuel led her upstairs to his room, the same room where he'd spent countless sleepless nights thinking about her. He gave her one of his old shirts to sleep in, showed her where the bathroom was, then excused himself while she changed. When he came back, she was sitting on the edge of his bed, swimming in his flannel, looking more beautiful than any memory he'd ever conjured. They lay down on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them, both staring at the ceiling in the darkness. Blue had followed them upstairs and now lay on the floor beside the bed, his gentle snoring the only sound in the room. "Sam?" Clara's voice was small in the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you for listening, for not sending me away, for being braver than I deserved." "You deserved better than what you got," Samuel said. "You deserved the life we planned, the one your father stole from us." "Maybe," Clara said. "But maybe this is what we needed, all the pain, all the years apart. Maybe we needed to be broken so we could learn how to heal." Samuel thought about that, about the man he'd been before the war and the man he'd become. The first one had been naive, believing love could conquer anything. The second had been hardened, believing nothing could conquer the pain of loss. But maybe there was a third version, one who'd been through hell and still chose hope, however fragile. "Clara?" he said into the darkness. "Yeah? I'm glad you came. Even if I don't know what happens next, even if this all falls apart tomorrow, I'm glad you came." He felt the bed shift as she moved closer, felt her hand find his in the darkness. Their fingers intertwined, and Samuel realized he was crying silently, tears sliding down into his hair. Not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer relief of not being alone anymore, of having someone who understood the shape of his grief because she carried one exactly the same. "I'm glad too," Clara whispered, and they fell asleep like that, hands clasped between them, the years of separation finally bridged by the simplest of connections. Samuel woke to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the smell of coffee drifting up the stairs. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was dreaming. Then he turned his head and saw the depression in the pillow next to his, the flannel shirt folded neatly on the chair, and remembered. Clara was here. Clara was real. He found her in his kitchen, Blue sitting attentively at her feet while she worked at the stove. She'd found his eggs, his bread, and somehow made his disaster of a kitchen look almost homey. She turned when she heard his footsteps, offering a tentative smile. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep anymore, and I thought—" She gestured at the pan. "Breakfast seemed like a good idea." "You didn't have to do that," Samuel said, but he was already moving toward the coffee pot, drawn by habit and need. "I wanted to." Clara plated the eggs, set them on his small table. "Besides, I needed to do something with my hands. Needed to feel useful." They sat across from each other, and in the morning light, Samuel could see her more clearly. The lines around her eyes, the gray in her hair, the weariness that came from carrying sorrow for too long. But he could also see the girl he'd loved, still there underneath everything else, like a photograph showing through its frame. "We should talk," Clara said, pushing her eggs around her plate. "About what comes next. About what this is." Samuel set down his fork, met her eyes. "What do you want it to be?" "I want—" Clara stopped, started again. "I want to not waste any more time. I want to get to know you again, the man you've become. I want to tell you about who I am now, not just who I was. I want to see if there's still something here worth fighting for." "And if there isn't?" The question hurt to ask, but it needed asking. "Then at least we'll know. At least we'll have tried." Clara reached across the table, her hand palm up, an offering. "But Sam, I have to tell you something. Something I realized last night. lying in your bed, holding your hand. What's that? I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. I tried. God knows I tried. I married another man, built another life, did everything I could to move on, but my heart never got the message. It stayed right here with you, in this town, waiting. She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. I'm still in love with you, Samuel Reed. 10 years later, 10 years too late, but the feeling never changed. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and true, all at once. Samuel felt his own heart hammering, felt the careful walls he'd built threatening to crumble entirely. He looked at her hand, still extended toward him, still waiting. I never stopped either, he said, and it felt like a confession, like absolution, like the truth he'd been running from for a decade. I hated you sometimes for it, hated that I couldn't let you go. But the love was always there, underneath everything else. Clara's smile was radiant through her tears. So what do we do with it? This love that refused to die? Samuel stood, came around the table, pulled her to her feet. He held her face in his hands, memorizing every detail, every change the years had written there. We give it a chance, a real chance. No more secrets, no more assumptions, no more letting other people decide our fate. One day at a time? Clara asked, echoing their words from the night before. One day at a time, Samuel confirmed, and then he kissed her. It was nothing like he remembered. It was better. It was sadder. It was more honest. It tasted like coffee and tears and second chances. It was a kiss between two people who'd lived entire lifetimes in separation, who carried scars that would never fully heal, but who were choosing each other anyway, choosing hope anyway. When they pulled apart, both breathless, Clara laughed, a sound of pure joy that Samuel had thought he'd never hear again. So this is day one, she said. This is day one, he agreed, and I have no idea what day two looks like. Neither do I, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. They spent the morning like that, in his small kitchen with his bad coffee and his rescued dog, talking about small things and large things and everything in between. Clara told him about the house she'd lived in with Robert, how she'd sold it immediately after his death, how she'd been staying with her cousin in Richmond while she figured out what to do with her life. Samuel told her about the farm, about the neighbors who'd become reluctant friends, about the quiet satisfaction of working the land and the equally quiet loneliness that came with it. Here. Let them talk, Samuel said, surprising himself with his vehemence. I've spent 10 years caring too much about what people think. I'm done with that. But your reputation. My reputation is that I'm a hermit who barely speaks to anyone. This can only improve things. He smiled, trying to lighten the moment. Besides, anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with me directly. Clara looked uncertain, torn between what was proper and what she wanted. What if this doesn't work? What if we try and it falls apart? Then we'll have scandalized the whole town for nothing. Or, Samuel countered, what if it does work? What if we spend the rest of our lives making up for lost time? Wouldn't that be worth a little scandal? She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing the options, calculating the risks. Then something shifted in her expression, some decision made. All right, but I'm going to need clothes and my things from the station. I left my trunk there yesterday. We'll get them, Samuel said. But first there's something I want to show you. He led her outside, blue trailing behind them, to the barn he'd been slowly rebuilding. It was still a work in progress, but the bones were good, the structure sound. Inside, he showed her the workshop he'd set up, the projects he worked on during long winter nights when sleep wouldn't come. You're building furniture, Clara said, running her hand over a half-finished chair. Keeps me busy, keeps my hands occupied. Samuel picked up a chisel, set it back down. I sell some pieces in town, give others away. It's not much, but it's something. It's beautiful, Clara said, and she meant it. She moved to a completed rocking chair, sat in it carefully. This is the kind of chair you rock babies in, the kind that gets passed down through generations. The mention of babies, of generations, hung heavy in the air. Samuel came to stand beside the chair, his hand resting on its back. I made it thinking about the life I didn't have, the family I didn't get to raise. Guess it was my way of making something permanent out of all that loss. Clara reached up, took his hand. Maybe it doesn't have to be about loss anymore. Maybe it can be about possibility instead. Maybe, Samuel allowed, and the word felt like the beginning of something. They spent the afternoon retrieving Clara's trunk from the station, and Samuel could feel the weight of eyes on them as they walked through town. Curtains twitched in windows. Conversations stopped as they passed. By nightfall, everyone in Hollow Creek would know that Samuel Reed had a woman staying with him, and the gossip mills would be working overtime. But for the first time in years, Samuel found he didn't care. Let them talk. Let them speculate. He'd spent too long living for everyone else's expectations, dying slowly under the weight of other people's decisions. This, Clara, this chance, this choice, was his alone. Back at the farm, they carried her trunk inside together, and the simple domesticity of it felt profound. Clara hung her dresses in his closet, set her brush on his dresser, placed her books on his shelves. With each small action, she was weaving herself into his space, into his life, and Samuel watched it happen with a mixture of wonder and terror. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun set. Blue sprawled between them and watched the sky turn colors that poets had spent centuries trying to describe and always failed. Clara's hand found his, and they sat like that in companionable silence, two people who'd said everything that needed saying and now could simply exist together. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked eventually. Samuel considered the question, tried to find words for the tangle of emotions in his chest. "I'm thinking about time, how we lost so much of it, how we can't get it back, but also how maybe we don't need to. Maybe the time we have now is enough, if we use it right." "And how do we use it right?" "Honestly," Samuel said, "no more secrets, no more hiding. We tell each other the truth, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. We don't let other people's fears dictate our choices. We just try to be real with each other." Clara squeezed his hand. "I can do that. I want to do that." "There's something else," Samuel said, turning to face her. "Something I need to say before we go any further." "What is it?" "I'm scared, Clara. Terrified, actually. You're the only person who's ever had the power to completely destroy me, and you're back in my life, and I'm choosing to let you in despite every instinct telling me to protect myself. That's either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever done, and I honestly don't know which." Clara's eyes were soft with understanding. "I'm scared too. Scared of losing you again, scared of not being enough, scared that we've both changed too much, that the love we had was for different people and won't work for who we are now." She paused, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. "But I'm more scared of not trying, of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what if." "So we're both terrified but doing it anyway," Samuel said with a wry smile. "Seems like the best decisions are usually the scariest ones," Clara replied. They watched the last of the light fade from the sky, watched the stars begin to appear one by one, ancient light from distant places finally reaching them. Samuel thought about those stars, about the time it took for their light to travel across the vast darkness, and he thought maybe that's what love was, light that traveled impossible distances, that arrived late but no less bright for the journey. "Clara?" he said into the gathering darkness. "Yes?" "Welcome home." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Samuel felt something in his chest unlock, some last defense finally crumbling. They sat there as the night deepened around them, two people who'd been lost finding their way back to each other, one moment at a time, one truth at a time, one choice at a time. The next morning arrived with a crispness that promised autumn was finally giving way to winter. Samuel woke to find Clara already up, standing at the bedroom window in his borrowed shirt, watching the frost patterns on the glass catch the early light. He lay there for a moment, just observing her, still half convinced that if he moved too quickly, she might vanish like morning mist. "You're staring," Clara said without turning around, a smile in her voice. "Can't help it," Samuel admitted, sitting up. "Still getting used to you being real, being here." She turned then, and the light behind her made her seem almost ethereal. "I had a dream last night. We were young again, standing at the station, but this time the letters arrived. This time everything went the way it was supposed to." Her voice caught slightly. "And then I woke up and realized this, you, me, now, This is better. Because we know what we're choosing. We know what it costs. Samuel rose, went to her, wrapped his arms around her from behind. They stood like that, looking out at his small kingdom of frost-covered fields and aging fences, and he felt something settle in his chest. Peace, maybe, or the beginning of it. "I need to check the fences today," he said. "North Pasture's been giving me trouble. You could come with me if you want, or stay here where it's warm." "I'll come," Clara said immediately. "I want to see all of it, your whole world." So after breakfast, Clara insisted on cooking again, and Samuel found he liked having someone fuss over him, even in small ways. They bundled up against the cold and headed out. Blue bounded ahead, delighted by the adventure, while Samuel and Clara walked side by side through fields that crunched beneath their boots. "It's beautiful," Clara said, her breath misting in the cold air. "Harsh, but beautiful. I can see why you chose this." "Chose is a strong word," Samuel said, adjusting the tool bag on his shoulder. "More like I ended up here and decided to stay. The land was cheap because the previous owner had let it go to hell. Everyone said I was crazy to buy it, but I needed a project, needed something to pour all the anger and hurt into. Turned out fixing broken things was easier than fixing myself." They reached the north fence, and Samuel could see immediately where posts had rotted, where wire had come loose. He set down his bag and began to work, and Clara watched for a moment before rolling up her sleeves. "Show me what to do," she said. "I want to help." "It's cold work, hard work." "I've done hard work before," Clara said, and there was steel in her voice. "Show me." So Samuel taught her how to pull the old posts, how to dig new holes in the half-frozen ground, how to string the wire tight and secure it properly. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional instruction or the sound of metal on wood. Clara's hands, soft from years of leisurely living, began to show signs of wear, small cuts, dirt under the nails, but she didn't complain. If anything, she seemed to relish the physical labor, the tangible proof of contribution. "Robert never let me do anything like this," she said after a while, hammering a staple into place with more force than necessary. "Said it wasn't ladylike. Said I should spend my time on needlework and charitable committees and making myself presentable for his business associates." "And did you? Make yourself presentable for them?" Clara's laugh was harsh. "I became exactly what he wanted. A perfect little doll who smiled at the right times and said the right things and never ever caused a scene. I was so good at it that sometimes I'd catch my reflection and not recognize myself. I'd think, who is that woman? What happened to Clara Mitchell?" Samuel stopped working, leaned on his post-hole digger. "You're not her anymore. That woman, the one you had to become. You don't have to be her now." "I know," Clara said, and she met his eyes with fierce determination. "That's why I'm here. That's why I'm getting dirt under my fingernails and learning to mend fences. I'm remembering who I was before the world told me who I had to be." They worked until noon, until the fence was secure and both of them were exhausted. Walking back to the house, Clara slipped on a patch of ice, and Samuel caught her, and for a moment they stood there, his arms around her waist, her hands gripping his shoulders, both of them breathless from more than just the near fall. "Thank you," Clara whispered, and Samuel knew she wasn't just talking about catching her. "Always," he replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. That afternoon, while Clara napped, the physical labor had worn her out more than she'd admit, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. He'd been thinking about something all morning, an idea that felt both terrifying and necessary. After staring at the blank page for 20 minutes, he finally began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, until he was pouring everything onto the page, all the thoughts he'd never spoken, all the feelings he'd kept locked away. It wasn't eloquent like the letter he'd written 10 years ago, full of youthful passion and naive hope. This was rougher, more honest, written by a man who'd learned that love wasn't just about grand gestures and pretty words, but about showing up day after day, even when it was hard. He was so absorbed in writing that he didn't hear Clara come downstairs, didn't notice her standing in the doorway until she spoke. "What are you working on?" Samuel looked up, suddenly self-conscious. "A letter. To you." Clara's eyebrows rose. "I'm right here. You could just talk to me." "I know, but some things are easier to write, and I thought..." He paused, searching for the right words. I thought maybe we could do it right this time. Exchange letters that actually reach each other. Build something on words that aren't lost or stolen or 10 years too late. Clara crossed the room slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. Can I read it? Samuel hesitated, then slid the paper across the table. He watched her face as she read, saw emotions flicker across it like clouds passing over the sun. When she finished, her eyes were wet. Sam, she whispered, this is too much, too soon. I can... Perfect, she interrupted. It's perfect. It's real and honest and everything I needed to hear. She wiped at her eyes. Can I write you one back? I'd like that. So Clara took the chair across from him, and Samuel gave her paper and pen, and they sat there in his kitchen writing letters to each other while being in the same room. It should have been absurd, but instead it felt sacred, like they were rebuilding something that had been broken, one carefully chosen word at a time. When Clara finished, she folded her letter and handed it to him. Samuel did the same with his. They read in silence, and Samuel felt his heart expand with each line of Clara's letter. She wrote about fear and hope, about the woman she'd been and the woman she wanted to become, about how loving him had been both the easiest and hardest thing she'd ever done. We should keep doing this, Clara said when they'd both finished reading. Even when we're together, even when we could just talk. There's something about writing it down that makes it more real, more permanent. Agreed, Samuel said, carefully folding her letter and placing it in his shirt pocket right over his heart. Though this time I'm keeping them all, building a collection of words that actually made it to their destination. That evening, they had their first real test. A knock came at the door just as they were finishing dinner, and Samuel opened it to find David Morrison standing on his porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. David, Samuel said, surprised. What brings you out here? Can I come in? There's something we need to talk about. Samuel stepped aside and David entered, nodding politely to Clara before turning his full attention to Samuel. I'm going to be direct because that's the only way I know how. The whole town's talking about you two, about her staying here, and some folks, well, they're not being kind about it. Let them talk, Samuel said, his jaw tightening. It's not just talk, Sam. Mrs. Henderson, Robert's mother, she's stirring up trouble. Says Clara's dishonoring her son's memory, carrying on with you before he's cold in the ground. She's got half the church ladies in an uproar, and they're planning to... David glanced at Clara apologetically. They're planning to confront Clara at the general store tomorrow. Make a scene. Clara had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Let them come. I'm not ashamed of being here. You don't understand how vicious these women can be, David warned. They can make your life hell in a town this size. Both of you. Then maybe this isn't the right town for us, Samuel said, and he was surprised to find he meant it. If people here can't mind their own business, can't let two people find a little happiness after years of misery, then maybe we don't need to be here. Clara stood, came to his side. Sam, this is your home, your farm. You can't just leave because of gossip. Home is where you are, Samuel said simply. The rest is just geography. David looked between them, something like admiration crossing his face. Well, I'll be damned. You really mean it, don't you? You'd give up everything you've built here rather than let them hurt her. In a heartbeat, Samuel confirmed. Then I guess I better tell you the other reason I came. David's stern expression cracked into a small smile. To say that not everyone in town is against you. Some of us think it's about damn time Samuel Reed found something to smile about. And if that means standing up to a bunch of bitter old women who've got nothing better to do than judge other people's choices, well, count me in. Samuel felt something loosen in his chest. You'd do that? You saved my life in France, David said quietly. Carried me 3 miles through enemy fire when I took that shrapnel to the leg. Far as I'm concerned, you're owed a lifetime of favors. This seems like a good place to start. He turned to Clara. Ma'am, you go to that store tomorrow and hold your head high. And if anyone gives you trouble, you tell them David Morrison says they can take it up with him. After David left, Samuel and Clara stood in the quiet house, processing what had just happened. The confrontation they'd been avoiding was coming whether they wanted it or not, and they'd have to face it together. I don't want you to lose everything because of me, Clara said softly. Your reputation, your place in this community, I already told you, I don't care about any of that. Samuel took her hands in his. But I do care about you, and I won't let anyone make you feel ashamed for choosing to be happy. Then we face them together, Clara said. Tomorrow, at the store, we show them we're not afraid. Together, Samuel agreed. They spent the evening preparing themselves emotionally for what was coming, talking through scenarios, steeling their nerves. But underneath the anxiety, Samuel felt something else, a strange sense of liberation. For 10 years he'd lived quietly, carefully, never making waves or drawing attention. But Clara's presence had changed everything, had reminded him what it felt like to care about something enough to fight for it. That night, lying in bed with Clara's hand in his, Samuel spoke into the darkness. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something. These last few days with you, they've been worth it. Worth every bit of scandal, every bit of trouble that might come. You've reminded me what it means to be alive, not just existing. Sam, Clara whispered, moving closer. I love you. I've loved you for 10 years, and I'll love you for 10 more, and 10 after that. No matter what anyone says or thinks or tries to do to us. I love you too, Samuel said, and the words felt like coming home, like finding something he'd thought was lost forever. Always have. Always will. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it a sense of impending confrontation. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a simple but dignified dress, pinning her hair back with deliberate precision. Samuel watched her armor herself with clothing and composure, watched her transform from the soft woman who'd slept in his arms to someone ready for battle. You look like you're going to war, he observed. Aren't I? Clara turned from the mirror, and her smile was sad but determined. In a way, aren't we both? They drove into town in Samuel's truck, and he could feel Clara's tension beside him, the way her hands gripped her purse a little too tight, the way her breathing had gone shallow. He reached over, took her hand, squeezed it once. We can turn around, he offered. Go back home. Let them have their gossip. We don't owe them anything. No, Clara said firmly. We do this. We show them we're not ashamed. We show them that their judgment doesn't define us. The general store was crowded when they arrived, more crowded than it should have been for a weekday morning. Samuel recognized the signs immediately. Word had spread, and people had come to watch the show. He felt Clara's hand tighten in his, felt her draw a deep breath. Ready? He asked. Ready, she confirmed. They walked in together, and the store fell silent. Every eye turned toward them, conversations dying mid-sentence. Samuel spotted Mrs. Henderson immediately, Robert's mother, dressed in black despite the 2 years since her son's death, her face twisted with righteous anger. She was surrounded by a group of churchwomen, all of them looking like they'd come to deliver judgment. Clara held her head high, led Samuel toward the counter where old Mr. Murphy stood looking deeply uncomfortable. She began to gather items, flour, sugar, coffee, moving with deliberate calm, refusing to acknowledge the stares, the whispers that had started up again. It was Mrs. Henderson who broke the standoff. She stepped forward, blocking Clara's path, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. How dare you show your face in decent company? How dare you flaunt your sin in front of God-fearing people? Clara stopped, met the older woman's eyes without flinching. Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. I hope you're well. Don't you dare act civilized with me, Mrs. Henderson spat. My son is barely cold in his grave, and you're already carrying on with this. Careful, Samuel said quietly, stepping forward. Choose your next words very carefully. I'll say what needs saying, Mrs. Henderson continued, but some of the fire had gone out of her voice at Samuel's tone. She was my son's wife. She owes his memory respect. She owes our family dignity. I owed your son nothing, Clara said, and her voice was clear and strong. I gave him 10 years of my life. 10 years of pretending, of playing the part of a dutiful wife to a man I didn't love. 10 years of dying inside while everyone told me how lucky I was. I've paid my debts, Mrs. Henderson. I'm done paying. The store was silent now, everyone hanging on every word. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, Samuel couldn't tell. You never loved him, Mrs. Henderson said, and now her voice wavered. All those years, and you never loved my boy. No, Clara said, and there was sadness in her voice now, but no apology. I didn't. I tried. God knows I tried. But you can't force love where it doesn't exist. Your son knew it too. He knew from the beginning, and it poisoned both of us, that knowledge. We made each other miserable for a decade because people like you decided that appearances mattered more than truth. How dare you blame? I'm not blaming anyone anymore, Clara interrupted. That's the point. I'm done with blame. I'm done with shame. I'm done with living my life according to other people's expectations. If that offends you, if that shocks your sensibilities, then I'm sorry. But I'm not sorry for choosing happiness. I'm not sorry for choosing him. She gestured to Samuel. I'm not sorry for finally choosing myself. One of the churchwomen spoke up, her voice dripping with disdain. And what about morality? What about propriety? You're living in sin with this man. I'm living, Clara said simply. For the first time in 10 years, I'm actually living instead of just existing. If you call that sin, then I'll gladly be a sinner. Samuel watched her, felt his heart swell with pride and love and fierce protectiveness. This was the Clara he'd known, the one who'd been buried under years of expectations and requirements. This was the woman who'd been brave enough to love him once, brave enough to love him again. She's right, a voice said from the back of the store, and everyone turned to see Mrs. Calloway, the widow who ran the boarding house. She's absolutely right. Most of you in this room have spent your whole lives doing what you're told, living how you're supposed to, and you're miserable for it. But you can't stand to see someone else break free, can you? Can't stand to see someone else choose happiness because it reminds you of all the choices you were too scared to make. Now see here, one of the churchwomen started, but Mrs. Calloway wasn't finished. I've lived in this town for 60 years, she continued. I've watched women shrivel up and die inside because they married the right man instead of the one they loved. I've watched men drink themselves to death because they were trapped in lives they never wanted, and I'm done with it. If Clara Mitchell wants to love Samuel Reed, if they want to build a life together, then I say more power to them. Lord knows they've both suffered enough. David Morrison stepped forward then, having quietly entered during the confrontation. Mrs. Calloway's right. Sam here's the finest man I know. He saved my life overseas and he's never asked for anything in return. If he's found someone who makes him happy, the least we can do is let him be. More voices joined in then, people Samuel barely knew, defending him, defending Clara, defending their right to choose each other. Not everyone, Mrs. Henderson and her closest allies remained tight-lipped and furious, but enough. Enough to matter. Clara was crying now, but they were tears of relief, of gratitude. She reached for Samuel's hand and he gave it freely, standing beside her in front of the entire town, claiming her, claiming this choice, claiming their future. Mrs. Henderson looked around, saw that she was losing the room, and drew herself up with as much dignity as she could muster. This isn't over, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Mark my words, this isn't over. Yes, it is, Samuel said quietly. It's been over since the moment Clara walked back into my life. You can accept it or not. That's your choice. But it won't change ours. Mrs. Henderson turned and swept out of the store, her allies trailing behind her like ducklings. The tension broke, and conversations resumed, though everyone was still casting glances at Samuel and Clara. Mr. Murphy cleared his throat from behind the counter. Well then, are you folks still needing those supplies? Clara laughed, a sound of pure relief, and nodded. Yes, please, and add whatever you think we might need for the next week. I have a feeling we'll be staying close to home for a while. They completed their shopping in relative peace, though people kept approaching them, some to offer quiet words of support, others just to satisfy their curiosity. Through it all, Samuel and Clara remained connected, hands clasped, presenting a united front. On the drive home, Clara was quiet, processing everything that had happened. Samuel glanced over at her, concerned. You okay? I'm better than okay, Clara said, and she sounded surprised by her own words. I stood up to them. I told the truth. I didn't hide or apologize or try to make myself smaller, and Sam, it felt incredible. You were magnificent, Samuel said honestly, watching you face them down, seeing you claim your truth. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. Clara turned to him, eyes shining. I couldn't have done it without you. Knowing you were beside me, knowing you'd stand with me no matter what, That gave me strength I didn't know I had. We make each other stronger, Samuel observed. That's how it's supposed to work, isn't it? Two people, making each other brave enough to face the world. They arrived back at the farm to find Blue waiting on the porch, tail wagging furiously at their return. As they unloaded the supplies, Samuel noticed Clara looking around with a different expression, more proprietary, more settled. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking this place needs a woman's touch," Clara said with a smile. "I'm thinking those curtains are hideous and the garden's a disaster and the kitchen could use a proper organization. I'm thinking—" She paused, suddenly uncertain. "I'm thinking I'd like to stay. Not just for now, but for good. If you'll have me." Samuel set down the bag he was holding, came to her, took her face in his hands. "I'll have you for as long as you'll stay. For as long as you'll tolerate a stubborn farmer with more scars than sense and a house that's falling apart." "Then I'm home," Clara said simply. "After 10 years of wandering, after a lifetime of being in the wrong place, I'm finally home." They stood there in the yard holding each other, and Samuel felt the last piece of his broken heart slot back into place. It wasn't perfect. They still had work to do, still had healing to finish, still had a future to build from the wreckage of their past. But for the first time in 10 years, Samuel believed it was possible. Believed that love could survive separation and sorrow, could bloom again in the hardest soil, could be stronger for having been tested. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go inside. We have planning to do." "Planning for what?" "For everything," Samuel said, and he meant it. "For tomorrow, and next week, and next year. For all the time we lost, and all the time we have ahead of us. For the life we're going to build together, one day at a time." Clara smiled, that radiant smile that had haunted his dreams for a decade, and followed him into the house that was becoming their home, into the future they were creating with each choice, each word, each moment of choosing to love each other despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the general store settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and deeply right. Clara transformed Samuel's house with quiet determination, not changing its essential character but bringing it to life in ways he hadn't known it needed. She planted herbs in the kitchen window, their green shoots reaching toward the winter sun. She mended the curtains he'd deemed hopeless, her needle moving with practiced efficiency while they sat by the fire in the evenings. She filled the silence he'd grown accustomed to with small sounds, humming while she cooked, the rustle of pages as she read, her laughter when Blue did something particularly endearing. But it wasn't all ease and comfort. There were moments when the weight of their history pressed down like a physical thing, when they'd catch each other staring into the distance, lost in thoughts of what might have been. Samuel would wake sometimes in the dead of night to find Clara crying silently beside him, and he'd hold her without asking why, knowing the grief was its own answer. Other times, he'd be the one paralyzed by memory, by flashes of the war or the years of loneliness, and Clara would draw him back with gentle touches and patient presence. 3 weeks after Clara's arrival, Samuel found her in the barn, standing in front of the rocking chair he'd made, her hand resting on its curved back. He approached quietly, saw the tears on her cheeks. "I can't stop thinking about them," she said without turning. "The children we never had, James and Sarah. They're so real to me sometimes that I can almost hear them laughing, almost see them running through these fields." Samuel came to stand beside her, his own throat tight. "I think about them too. Wonder what kind of father I would have been, if I could have given them a good life." "You would have been wonderful," Clara said with certainty, patient and strong and kind. Everything a child needs. "And you would have been fierce and loving, would have taught them to be brave, to stand up for themselves the way you did at the store." They stood there together, mourning children who existed only in possibility, grieving for the family they'd been denied. It was Clara who finally spoke, her voice rough with emotion. "We can't change what happened. Can't bring back those lost years or the life we should have had. But Sam," she turned to face him fully, "we still have time. Not for children, maybe. We're too old for that, and I think we're too broken besides. But for something. For building something real with whatever years we have left." "What kind of something?" Samuel asked, though he thought he knew. A life, Clara said simply. A real one. The kind where we wake up every morning and choose each other. Where we work this land together and grow old together, and maybe, if we're lucky, we find some kind of peace with all we've lost. Samuel pulled her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, felt her heartbeat against his chest. I want that, he said. Want it more than I've wanted anything in 10 years. Then let's do it right, Clara said, pulling back to look at him. Let's get married, Sam. Not because people expect it, not to quiet the gossips, but because I want to stand in front of God and everyone and claim you as mine. I want everyone to know that you're my choice, that I'm yours, that nothing and no one will ever separate us again. Samuel's heart stuttered. Marriage. The word carried so much weight, so much history. It was what they'd planned once before the world had torn them apart. It was what Clara had done with someone else while he'd wandered in grief. But now, spoken in his barn with her eyes full of hope and determination, it felt like redemption. Are you sure? He asked. After everything? After the years you spent trapped in a marriage that made you miserable? That wasn't a marriage, Clara said fiercely. That was a prison sentence. This, you and me, this is what marriage is supposed to be. A choice we make every day. A partnership built on truth and love and mutual respect. I'm not afraid of it anymore, Sam. I'm only afraid of wasting more time, of letting fear keep us from claiming what's ours. Samuel felt something crack open in his chest, some last barrier crumbling. Then yes, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll stand up in front of this whole damn town and anyone else who wants to watch, and I'll promise you forever. However long forever is, it's yours. Clara's smile was brilliant through her tears. When? Soon, Samuel said. Before winter really sets in. Before anything else can go wrong or get in the way. Soon as we can arrange it. They kissed there in the barn, surrounded by tools and sawdust, and the chair meant for children they'd never have. And it felt like sealing a pact, like writing the ending to a story that had taken 10 years too long to tell. The wedding preparations were simple by necessity and choice. Clara had no desire for elaborate ceremonies or grand gestures. She'd had that with Robert, and it had been hollow and meaningless. What she wanted, what they both wanted, was something honest and small, witnessed by the people who'd stood with them. David Morrison agreed to stand as Samuel's best man, and Mrs. Calloway offered to stand with Clara. The ceremony would be at the small church on the hill, performed by Pastor Williams, who'd known Samuel since before the war and had the good sense not to preach judgment. The date was set for the first Saturday in December, just 2 weeks away. But as word spread through Hollow Creek, the simple wedding began to take on a life of its own. People started offering help. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery insisted on making a cake. The Fletcher brothers offered to play music. Others brought offerings of food or flowers or good wishes. Not everyone, of course. Mrs. Henderson and her circle remained icily disapproving, but their influence had waned since the confrontation at the store. Samuel watched it all with a mixture of bemusement and gratitude. He'd spent so long on the margins of this community, present but not really part of it, and now people were rallying around them, making their wedding into something communal. They feel like they have a stake in this, Clara observed one evening as they reviewed the growing list of attendees. Like our story is their story too, somehow. Maybe it is, Samuel said. Maybe everyone's carrying their own version of loss and regret, and seeing us find our way back to each other gives them hope that it's not too late for them either. The night before the wedding, Samuel couldn't sleep. He lay beside Clara, listening to her breathe, thinking about the vows he'd say tomorrow, about the promise he'd make to cherish and protect this woman who'd already survived so much. Around midnight, he carefully extracted himself from bed and went downstairs, Blue padding after him. He found himself drawn to the letters, both the old ones that had arrived too late and the new ones they'd been writing to each other. He spread them out on the kitchen table, reading them in chronological order, watching their story unfold in ink and paper. The young man's passionate declaration from before the war, Clara's reply that never reached him, the careful, honest words they'd exchanged in recent weeks, building trust one sentence at a time. Can't sleep either? Clara's voice came from the doorway, and Samuel looked up to see her wrapped in his old robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. Too much thinking, he admitted. She came to sit beside him, looked at the letters spread across the table. Our whole history, right here. every version of us we've ever been. Do you ever wish we could go back? Samuel asked. Be those young people again, the ones who thought love was simple? Clara considered the question, her finger tracing the edge of the oldest letter. No, she said finally. I wouldn't trade the people we are now, even for the innocence we lost. We know things now. We know what we're choosing. We know what love costs and what it's worth. Those kids in the letters. They were beautiful and hopeful, but they didn't know anything real. And we do? We know that love isn't enough on its own, Clara said. We know it needs honesty and courage and the willingness to keep choosing it even when it's hard. We know it can survive separation and betrayal and years of grief. We know it can come back, scarred but stronger. She turned to him, her eyes bright in the lamplight. That's worth more than all the innocence in the world. Samuel took her hand, brought it to his lips. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. You already are, Clara said. You were worthy 10 years ago, and you're worthy now. You just have to believe it. They sat there until dawn, talking about small things and large things, about the future they'd build and the past they'd survived. When the sun finally rose, painting the kitchen gold, they were ready. The church was packed by the time Samuel arrived. It seemed half of Hollow Creek had turned out, curiosity and genuine affection bringing them in equal measure. David was waiting by the altar, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, and he clapped Samuel on the shoulder as he approached. You ready for this? David asked. More ready than I've ever been for anything, Samuel replied, and meant it. The music started. A simple hymn played on violin by one of the Fletcher brothers, and everyone turned toward the back of the church. Samuel's breath caught as Clara appeared in the doorway. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, nothing like the elaborate white gown she'd worn for Robert. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She carried a small bouquet of winter flowers, and her eyes were locked on Samuel's from the moment she appeared. Mrs. Calloway walked beside her, not giving her away, as that implied she belonged to someone other than herself, but standing with her as a friend and witness. They moved down the aisle together, and Samuel watched every step, memorizing it, knowing he'd remember this moment for whatever time he had left. When Clara reached him, Mrs. Calloway stepped aside, and Samuel took Clara's hands in his. They stood facing each other while Pastor Williams began to speak, but Samuel barely heard the words. He was too focused on Clara, on the fact that she was here, that this was real, that nothing was going to stop them this time. Samuel, the pastor said, pulling him back to the moment, do you have vows you wish to speak? Samuel nodded, drew a breath, and spoke the words he'd spent all night preparing. Clara, I loved you when we were young, before I knew what love really meant. I loved you through years of war and grief when I thought I'd lost you forever. And I love you now, standing here, knowing exactly what I'm promising and what it costs. I vow to choose you every day, in every way I can. I vow to be honest, even when it's hard, to stand beside you even when the world tells us we're wrong, to build a life with you that honors all we've survived. I can't give you back the years we lost, but I can give you all the years I have left. And I do. Freely and completely, I give them to you. Tears were streaming down Clara's face, but her voice was steady when she spoke her own vows. Sam, you were my first love and my last love and every love in between, even when I tried to convince myself otherwise. You've been the measure by which I judged every moment of my life, the standard of what real and honest and true could be. I vow to match your honesty with my own, to stand as your equal partner in all things, to never let fear or pride or other people's expectations come between us again. I vow to love you not despite our scars, but because of them, because they're proof we survived, proof we're strong enough to build something lasting. I give you my heart, my hand, my future, everything I am, and everything I'll be. Pastor Williams smiled, clearly moved despite himself. Then, by the power vested in me and in the presence of these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife. Samuel, you may kiss your bride. Samuel pulled Clara close and kissed her as the church erupted in applause. It was a kiss that contained everything, past and present and future, grief and joy, endings and beginnings. When they pulled apart, both were crying, both were smiling, both were finally home. The reception was held in the church hall, and it was nothing like the formal affair Clara had endured for her first wedding. This was loud and chaotic and real, with children running between tables and old men telling war stories, and women trading recipes and gossip in equal measure. Samuel and Clara moved through it all hand in hand, accepting congratulations and well wishes, feeling the community's embrace. David gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in turns. "I've known Sam Reed for 20 years, he said, raising his glass, and I've never seen him smile the way he smiles when he looks at Clara. That's all any of us want, really. Someone who makes us remember what joy feels like." To Sam and Clara, and to second chances. To second chances, the crowd echoed, glasses raised. As the evening wore on and the celebration showed no signs of slowing, Samuel and Clara slipped away quietly, walking out into the cold December night. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes that caught in Clara's hair and on Samuel's shoulders. "We should go home," Clara said, and the word home sounded like a benediction, like everything they'd been fighting for. They drove through the snowy darkness, the farmhouse lights visible from a distance, a beacon calling them back. Inside, Blue greeted them with his usual enthusiasm, and the fire Samuel had banked before leaving still glowed in the hearth. Clara kicked off her shoes, unpinned her hair, and curled up on the sofa. Samuel joined her, and they sat there in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance, feeling the weight and wonder of what they'd done. "Mrs. Clara Reed," Samuel said, testing the name. "How does it feel?" "Right," Clara said simply. "For the first time in my life, my name feels right." Samuel pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, making everything clean and new. Inside, they sat in the warmth of their home, building their future moment by moment. "Tell me something," Clara said after a while. "Something I don't know about you yet. Something from the years we were apart." Samuel thought about it, sifting through memories both painful and mundane. "There was a night," he said slowly, "about 5 years ago. I was at my lowest point, ready to give up on everything. I went down to the creek with a bottle of whiskey and a loaded gun, and I sat there for hours trying to convince myself to use one or both." Clara's hand tightened on his, but she didn't interrupt. "I couldn't do it," Samuel continued, "and for the longest time I couldn't figure out why. I had nothing to live for, nothing to hope for. But sitting there in the dark, I heard your voice in my head. Not real, just a memory. You were laughing at something, that laugh you had when something struck you as genuinely funny. And I thought if I ended it, I'd never hear that laugh again, even in memory. I'd never have the chance to find out if you were somewhere in the world still laughing. It was a slim thread to hang life on, but it was enough. I poured out the whiskey, unloaded the gun, and I went home. And I kept going day after day, on the hope that maybe someday I'd hear that laugh for real." Clara was crying silently, her tears soaking into his shirt. "You stayed alive for me. Even when you thought I'd betrayed you, even when you had every reason to let go, you stayed alive." "I stayed alive for the possibility of you," Samuel corrected gently. "For the chance that maybe the story wasn't over, and I was right. It wasn't over. It was just waiting for the right moment to continue." They held each other as the fire burned low and the night deepened around them. Eventually, they made their way upstairs to the bedroom that was now truly theirs, shared without hesitation or reservation. They made love slowly, tenderly, two people learning each other's bodies while already knowing each other's souls. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Clara's heartbeat against his chest, Samuel felt something he'd thought lost forever: peace. Not the absence of pain or the erasure of regret, but something deeper. The peace that comes from acceptance, from knowing you found your place in the world and the person you're meant to share it with. "Clara?" he whispered, not sure if she was still awake. "Hmm?" "Thank you for being too late and exactly on time all at once." He felt her smile against his skin. "Thank you for waiting, for keeping the door open even when you thought you shouldn't." They drifted to sleep like that, wrapped around each other, the letters that had brought them back together still sitting on the kitchen table downstairs, evidence of a love that had survived impossible odds, that had found its way home despite everything that tried to prevent it. The weeks turned into months, and winter gave way to spring. Samuel taught Clara everything about running the farm, and she proved to be a quick study, throwing herself into the work with the same determination she'd shown in everything else. They planted a garden together, Clara's hands in the soil beside his, and as the seeds began to sprout, it felt symbolic of what they were building. New life from old ground. There were still hard days, still moments when the ghosts of their past rose up to haunt them. But they'd learned to face those moments together, to speak the truth of their pain rather than letting it fester in silence. They wrote letters to each other still, even though they shared a bed every night, because some truths were easier to explore on paper, and the act of writing had become their way of processing, of preserving, of promising. On the anniversary of Clara's arrival at Hollow Creek Station, Samuel took her back to the platform where it had all begun again. They stood in the same spots they'd occupied that rainy evening, and Samuel pulled out a letter, the original one he'd written before the war, now carefully preserved. "I want to read you something," he said. "The words I wrote when I still thought love was simple, before I knew what it would cost us." Clara nodded, her eyes already wet with tears. Samuel read the letter aloud, his younger self's voice speaking through him. The passionate declarations, the innocent hopes, the absolute certainty that love could conquer anything. When he finished, he folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. "I was wrong," he said. That boy who wrote those words, he was wrong about a lot of things. Love didn't conquer everything. It didn't stop the war or deliver the letters or prevent the years of suffering. But he was right about one thing. He was right about you being worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth everything. Clara pulled out her own letter, the reply she'd written 10 years ago. And she read it aloud too, her younger self's promises hanging in the air. When she finished, she looked at Samuel with fierce determination. "I want to make new vows," she said, "right here, where you told me I was too late. I want to replace those words with better ones." Samuel took her hands, and right there on the platform where their story had nearly ended, they spoke new promises to each other. Not the formal vows of their wedding, but something more personal, more specific to who they were and what they'd survived. "I promise to remember that we're enough," Clara said. "That our love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, that we can carry our scars and still build something beautiful." "I promise to trust this," Samuel replied, "to stop waiting for it to fall apart, to believe that we've earned this happiness, that we deserve this chance." They stood there as trains came and went, as other people's stories of arrival and departure played out around them. And when they finally left, walking back to Samuel's truck hand in hand, they left something behind on that platform. The weight of might-have-beens, the burden of too late, the grief of all those lost years. What they carried forward was lighter and stronger. The knowledge that love could be lost and found again, that it was never truly too late if you were brave enough to try, that the best stories were the ones that knew how to survive, how to adapt, how to begin again. That evening, sitting on their porch with blue at their feet and the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Samuel turned to Clara and asked, "Are you happy?" Clara considered the question seriously, looking out at the land they tended together, the home they'd built, the life they were living. "I'm more than happy," she said finally. "I'm at peace. I'm whole. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly who I'm supposed to be with. That's better than happy. That's home." Samuel pulled her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, felt the steady rhythm of her breathing. Around them, the farm settled into evening, the birds calling their last songs, the breeze rustling through new leaves, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that makes up most of a life, but it was theirs, earned through suffering, bought with years of grief, made precious by the knowledge of how easily it could have been lost. And in that ordinary, precious moment, Samuel Reed understood something fundamental about time and love and second chances. It was never too late as long as you were still breathing, still hoping, still willing to reach across the distance for the hand you'd thought you'd lost forever. The letters might arrive late, the timing might be all wrong, the world might conspire against you in 1,000 ways, but love, real love, the kind that mattered, was patient enough to wait, strong enough to survive, and brave enough to begin again. Claire's hand found his in the gathering darkness, and they sat there together as night fell. Two people who'd been too late and exactly on time, who'd lost everything and found it all again, who'd learned that the best love stories were the ones that refused to end, even when the whole world said they should. Their story wasn't perfect. It was scarred and complicated and built on the ruins of what might have been. But it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.